I love G.K. Chesterton's quote. He said, Christianity, if you know Chesterton, a lot of you like Lewis, like to read Lewis. I love Chesterton because he's got an acerbic wit. And he was one of those guys who was attacking the church early in his life, but then became a believer late. And so he uses that wit then to turn things around. And one of the things he says about Christianity, he said, as I was starting to come to Christ and get to know Christianity, it seemed like they had all these rules. And I kept getting hemmed in. And then he said, until I realized that when I was actually hemmed in from God's point of view, it was so that freedom could run wild. And those of you know how to, keep the horses, in the place where they belong so that they can just run and they're protected and they're not susceptible to disease or susceptible to poachers or whatever. You can see that analogy. God hems us in. Why? So we can run wild. And so again, I love that kind of idea of who we are. So freedom, humanity's rebellion. I love Revelation 12. I know I tend to think that's the cosmic Christmas, although I've been told that's a faulty interpretation. But that's where Satan is literally scouring the earth looking for the child, looking to devour the child. You think of Herod, trying to kill all the innocents to try to see if he can wipe out Jesus. And then, of course, 1 John, when it talks about Satan being in control of things, it just seems that's true today more than ever. But it's always been this way. Kingdoms in conflict. We are in this world, not of it. The ancient dilemma, then, is the same as the modern dilemma. What is God going to do with this world? And so all I'm going to do now in number 3 is just say God is going to engage it. And he engages it 2 ways. There's a preserving need, because if we would be allowed to do whatever we want as sinful people, we would eventually destroy ourselves. Isn't that the Tower of Babel? God actually says if we let them do whatever they want, it's not that they're going to build a tower to heaven, it's that they're going to build a tower to hell, and they're going to destroy themselves. So he blows it apart. And he puts us in our own tribes and languages so we can't get along. That was for our own protection, by the way. What's the only event that turns Babel around? Pentecost. That's why I always tell my folks, if you think there's going to be a public policy that's going to do it, it's not going to work. Trust not in princes. They've got a role to play in our life, but they're not going to save us. They're not going to bring us together when only God himself can do it in Jesus Christ. But he did Babel, and he did Pentecost. So again, there's a preserving need. God has to preserve his world so that the saving message can be heard by all. So God is at work. So the Bible's solution is that God is at work 2 different ways. This is you Lutherans. You Lutherans are saying God is at work. We call it 2 kingdoms, 2 kinds of righteousness. I call it 2 kingdom citizenship. So God is at work to preserve, God is at work to save, so I want to be a part of God's work. If it's a preserving thing, I want to ask the right questions, I want to be useful in his hands to preserve the things he wants preserved. But if it's a saving thing, I want to be able to share the gospel. So we're going to talk about what are the kind of questions I should ask if it's a preserving issue. What are the kind of questions I should ask if it's a evangelism, saving opportunity. And we'll differentiate those questions. Dynamic differentiation. That's you. And that's your people too. And I think our people need to understand that they've been created for a time like this. So God engages the world. It's hard for us to understand how he engages the world to preserve it even through non-believers. That's one of the toughest teachings. You see that going on with the whole dynamics of whether Trump's a Christian, whether Trump's not a Christian, whether Nancy Pelosi's a Christian, whether she's not a Christian. And you start going, are any of these people Christian? Who cares about whether they're Christian? Are they doing what I think they should do as president or Speaker of the House? And how can you Lutherans talk that way? You actually bring some sanity to the discussions around the table. Isn't that neat? You actually can bring a lot of different voices to tables too if you define the opportunity properly. So again, God engages the world, and this is one of the ways, and we talk about it in a mom and pop paper. This is why the family is also the issue. I didn't talk about how the family is the big issue too, but we look at the family as a religious liberty issue. But if a culture denies the preeminence of the family, it cannot survive. And that's why we even talk about good policy has to undergird the family. It has to keep the family first. Everything else flows from family. Government flows from family. Police flow from family. Teacher flows from family. If you flip those upside down where the family somehow, the teacher comes first, the government bureaucrat comes first, or the government comes first, and then the family, you're going to have all kinds of policy problems. And by the way, in my urban ministry, that's the number one issue. I don't care what anybody says. The data is overwhelming. My thesis was all about this. The number one issue is the destruction of the family. It undergirds the poverty, crime, illiteracy, all those things, because they drove the man out of the house. And so again, as we go back into the city, that's got to be that's got to be part of our left-hand kingdom work. Even if they don't join our church, we got to somehow stabilize neighborhoods by stabilizing families. And those are the kind of things. So again, when we talk about God's solution, he has these sociological things he builds in. So church, family, government, these are important things, but they all have a relationship with one another. You should teach your people what that relationship is. Ultimately, so that you can hear the good news of the gospel and that there is a world that will never end because Jesus Christ is coming and there will be a new heavens and a new earth. All right, so as we look at these two realms, God at work, even the political realm then is part of God's endeavor. When Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's, it's not like he's just saying Caesar doesn't matter to God, because remember what he says to Pilate later. You have this because you're still under his control too. And so again, we start to ask these questions. So I'll close with these definitions. And what is the state? When we look at the state as Lutherans, by the way, one of the great things that you Lutherans can do in these public discussions is you can bring this notion that not everything is public is political. The big issue that I'm seeing happening in D.C. is everything is political. The Boy Scouts are political. The Boys Club is political. When you get together with fellow churches to do something in the neighborhood, you're going to find out that there are people watching you to see whether or not you do it the right way, and then they'll politicize that event. And we've got to get back to understanding, no, there's a thing called public that's not political, and that's where the church can start to fashion partnerships in the neighborhood, can lead discussion groups, can lead issues in the neighborhood that are actually blessing the neighborhood just for the sake of blessing the neighborhood, but you can be spearheading that, and it can be apolitical. And we got to get back to that. I don't know if we ever will or not with the way things are today, but that's another thing we can be fighting for. So as we look at these things, the state, what is the state? It's God's work in the things common to all people, believers and non. 1 Peter tells us again that the state is a godly ordained institution. When I was asked to speak at Concordia, Portland before it unraveled, it was interesting. They wanted me to speak about two kingdoms. Now these are college students. So what do you think was on their mind? This is what I said, of all the things that they wanted me to talk about, they said, can you come and talk to us about civil disobedience? They kind of had a gleam in their eye. No, I'm just teasing. Isn't that funny? Because at that age, the question is, how can we be civilly disobedient? And my answer to them was, the only way a Christian can be civilly disobedient is to be what? Obedient to God. So even Christian civil disobedience is not just because you have a passion for it. It's not just because you're ticked off. It's because you understand very clearly that God wants something completely different than this. So you have to stand there and go against whatever's coming your way because God wants it done. So civil disobedience, even for the Christian, is obedience because the state is a godly ordained institution. If you are fighting with the state, you're fighting against God's ordained institution. And so I love to have these discussions about it when people say, well, what's civil disobedient? When can I be disobedient, etc.? I say, well, for Lutherans, that's a pretty tall order to get to the point where we're standing against it all. When Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, do you understand what he said? Caesar was a beast. Caesar eventually was killing Christians. There's a sense where we still have to find a way to honor this guy, even though it looks like everything he's doing is wrong. Teach that. How to do that well so that you do speak the truth even to Caesar, but you speak it as God's voice, and you speak it for the sake of the gospel. That's the kind of stuff we two kingdom people have to really deal with all the time. Okay? So the state is temporal. It's an emergency arrangement. For those of us who believe in things like free markets and stuff, it's whatever organizes us to mitigate our selfishness the best. I mean, that's honestly what I think is so when you even think about how the founding fathers organized the tripartite state, so you had executive branch, judicial branch, and legislation, it was so that they would all get in each other's way. Because they thought if they all started doing things in the same way, that there would be tyranny and there would be power coalesced in the hands of sinful people, which would be a bad thing. And so the state, if it's doing its job, is just mitigating evil, the best that evil people can do. So think that through as you talk about, if you get into any discussions like on communism or on socialism or capitalism or all these different kinds of things, it's usually which one mitigates our worst tendencies the best. It's not which one does the right thing the most, because we tend to find out that we tend to do what's in our best interest no matter what. So even the state itself is an outgrowth of the fourth commandment. They're agents of God's preserving authority. So you can see in the Christian way of thinking, the state has a role, but it is a secondary role to the proclamation of the gospel. Now, how that relates is another thing. The founding fathers put the state on the bottom and put the individual, self-disciplined Christian on the top. That's being turned upside down today. But the question of where it belongs, I think we as Christians can say, well, anybody who thinks the state can solve all these problems, that is a very misguided thing. Because it was a temporary thing that God hoisted into our culture because of sin. And so it can never be his solution if it's a temporary stopgap thing for the sake of Genesis 3. Genesis 9 comes later. Genesis 3 comes first. Family comes first. Government comes later. So just keeping that intention, keeping that understanding will help you as you teach your people how to deal with some of these issues. And then what is the church? Obviously, God is at work through his unique gifts, calling people of all tribes and nations to faith. As I said before, I wanted to come and talk these things through with you just because I think our message, our unique message of the sacramental gospel is needed now more than ever. I really struggle with this online church stuff. And those of you who know me, you know I was the Lutheran Hour speaker too, so I was also an online guy. And I struggled. I actually said, we can't do Lutheran Hour unless we do it through the church. Because it's the church that finally gathers. It's the church that's finally willing to actually hold one another. It's the church that finally gathers around the real presence of Christ, where he literally splashes on us. You can't splash through the TV. Now, they tried to do it. Remember the Tulsa guys? They tried to put their hands on the TV sets back in the day. That's a misunderstanding of his anointing, right? There's a certain sense that the ministry that you've been given is supposed to be in the middle of these people. And these people are supposed to be gathered to you. And you're supposed to actually blood, sweat, and tears with them until you give them to Jesus. And of course, all of us who took our vows seriously realize that someday we're going to stand before the Lord and he's going to say, what did you do with the people I gave you? We take that seriously. There's a lot of people who don't take that seriously anymore. I'm a pastor. I got a card. I kind of do my thing online. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't mean that you can't use that. And so I was proud to be on the radio. I was proud to do that work, but it had to somehow drive people back to being with other Christians around the means of grace. And so I think if we start to struggle with this, like you're already struggling with, how do I get back to reaching out to people in the middle of COVID-19? If you struggle with that, and some of you are going to take risks to do that, and some of it might not turn out well for you. but you're struggling to be that real present voice of the real present gospel in the middle of this stuff. And let's not judge each other if we all don't do the same thing in that regard, but at the same time, let's make sure we understand what we have. Words, water, bread, and wine. Christ is with us. So again, when we started to even talk about the pandemic and all that kind of stuff, it's challenging what it means to be the body of Christ. But I'm saying our message is so incredible. I got a chance to say this one time. I was leading a Bible study on Wall Street. We had a Bible study. When I was in New York, we had stuff all over the place. We had stuff in Harlem. We had, in fact, just to give you guys some positive peeps here, we had a confirmation class in Harlem. And their families were so committed to it. They would meet with us at 6 in the morning at McDonald's before their kids went to school. That's how, once they heard that we were willing to do that, they said anytime, any place. So don't write off any neighborhood. You never know who's in the midst of those places. But we had this Bible study on Wall Street. Now think about that, Wall Street. You know, these are the guys making millions of dollars. And by the way, we were invited in. It was, the long story was, it was just a bunch of lay folks who started a Bible study, and then eventually it was by one of the Forbes guys, because it costs a lot of money to rent space in Wall Street. And then we got invited in because they heard our teaching and they liked it. Finally, one day, I'm talking to all these guys, and there's all kinds of people, all different faith traditions, even some non-believers in there. And they finally said, what makes you Lutherans different? So the question finally is, how would you answer that? You probably got 30 seconds. And the best answer I ever came up with over time, because I came up with a lot of bad ones at first, but over time I began to realize we preach a Christ they don't. So a lot of them were like, yeah, you got to meet Christ halfway. You got to decide for Jesus. He comes 99% of the way. You come 1% of the way. They got all this stuff. In fact, there was one debate one time about whether this one guy was a Christian. His name was Bill, and they said, Bill, we're not sure if he's a Christian. And they started ranting and raving about whether Bill's life is showing signs of sanctification or not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, where's Bill? Can we go talk to Bill? Bill was sitting right there. And I looked at Bill, I said, Bill, do you believe in Jesus? Yes. Are you baptized? Yes. You're a Christian. He went, yay! Now, is Bill the kind of Christian he wants to be? Obviously not. But the proof of his Christianity is what Jesus says of Bill, not what Bill is struggling with in response to Jesus. That's Lutherans talking. God doesn't need my good works, Bill. Neighbor does. So yeah, you got some work to do. You need to be a better neighbor to this, that, and the other thing, but you need to be resourced in the certainty that you have in Jesus. And that comes from Jesus, word and sacrament. Straight up, straight out. When he says it, it is. So anyway, I finally looked at these guys and they said, well, what makes Lutherans different? And I said, well, a lot of you guys talk about Christ coming, right? Yeah, Christ come. I said, well, you always kind of say that he stops and kind of waits on us. And I'm telling you, if Christ has to wait on me, I'm messed up, okay? I didn't use that word at the time. I just said, but we preach a Christ who comes all the way to where we are, through words, water, bread, and wine, because words, we don't understand things, so he comes in words. We need to touch, taste, smell, that everything he says is true for me. So he comes every sensory way I need him to come and says, I did it all for you. And I'll never forget, and these are some cool guys. I was privileged to work with them. They said, we've never heard about that Jesus. You preach it every Sunday. So, I guess this first session, I just wanted to lay it out for you. I wanted to get a little deeper on it. This is the kind of stuff you talk with your people and say, before we get into any of this politics stuff, because by the way, politics isn't going to save us, so I don't need community organizers in my church. I don't need people calling the governor right after we have Bible study on this. We've got a process called Champions for Liberty that if you want to get people organized on this stuff, we have a whole year process that teaches them how to be servants, teaches them how to be useful in God's hands, teaches them how to be a servant to the work of the church, not to be out there just going their direction because they're not politically agitated. That's a real danger. And I understand that danger, and if we do ever work with your church, know that we're going to make sure that doesn't happen. okay, and how we train them. But again, as we think about this depth of the gospel, this depth of the freedom that we have, both our created freedom and our eternal freedom that because of Christ's work, that's what the church needs to understand. And nobody can take that away from you. Nobody. They can put a mask on you, and there's some places that are putting masks on us and telling us you'll never worship again, not until we're ready to let you do it. Some churches are saying, no, that time is past. But even if they put a mask on you, they can't stop you from being Christ's people for other people. They can't do that. There's a catacombs version of Christianity for a reason. But again, where are we in that whole panoply of things? We'll talk about it. But again, I want you to understand that. And the last thing I will leave you with is Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus is finally tempted. I think right now there are some of us who think if we just get the politics right, all this will go back to the sanity that we supposedly had beforehand. I think that's the temptation that Jesus has when Satan takes him up on a high mountain and says, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world if you will just bow down and worship me. I think we Lutherans, if we really take our theology seriously, understand we will always be in tension with two kingdoms. We're always going to understand that even if we do stuff well in the left-hand kingdom, it's just temporal. There's something else that's going to break loose. For every solution, we created another problem. How many of you ever changed your constitution in church? It solved some problems. What did it do? It created some other problems, because that's polity, okay? That's polity with sinful human beings. But you better have one so that you don't just let chaos reign. But we don't ever put our ultimate hope and dreams in that kind of discussion. And that's Jesus looking and saying, get thee behind me, Satan, kind of stuff. You will worship the Lord your God. Him only will you serve. And so you bring that love of both freedoms for your people, but you also differentiate those freedoms, and then you want to be faithful to how God works in both those freedoms, ultimately for the sake of the gospel. So the last thing I share with you is our motto, and that is learn how to put your temporal liberties to work for the sake of the eternal liberties of Christ. And that's going to be our next discussion right after lunch, where we'll start to break down and get into this. But remember the Apostle Paul. Remember what he did. He gets beat up in Ephesus. And if you're the guards, they go, oh no, he's a Roman citizen. What do we do now? And you remember what Paul they could have probably just said this, and if you've been to Ephesus, you remember where you can kind of see the whole thing play out. I'm sure they were saying, look, Paul, if we just let you go and you don't bother us with this, hey, anytime you want to come back here, preach the gospel, no problem. We'll usher you right here to the amphitheater and you can have at it. So you could kind of see Paul saying, that would be good. Then I could come preach whenever I wanted to. And then he says, no, I'm going to put my temporal liberties to work. You didn't have the right to beat me to the point of death, and I want to take my case to Caesar himself. And he winds up preaching the gospel to Caesar himself. So I'm just saying the liberty Paul had to do that, you have way more blessings than he had at that moment, because you've been given First Amendment liberties. In fact, in America, Caesar is the citizen. It's been turned totally upside down. So if you give to Caesar what is Caesar's, the question is, you're Caesar. What are you going to do? Because the citizen in America is put in that role, and then the legislature flows from that. So when you contextualize this stuff, what a blessing it is what God has given us. But let's honor the fact that the roots and the enduring power of freedom is something much deeper than just this discussion of how can we be good citizens in America. Well, God bless you. I think we'll see you afterwards. And again, if you have questions, write them down. I'm going to save that last session for questions, and I'll take whatever you want to talk about from the floor. Okay? All right. God bless you. Underwritten by one of the Forbes guys, because it costs a lot of money to rent space in Wall Street. And then we got invited in because they heard our teaching and they liked it. Finally, one day, I'm talking to all these guys, and there's all kinds of people, all different faith traditions, even some non-believers in there. And they finally said, what makes you Lutherans different? So the question finally is, how would you answer that? You probably got 30 seconds. And the best answer I ever came up with over time, because I came up with a lot of bad ones at first, but over time I began to realize we preach a Christ they don't. So a lot of them were like, yeah, you got to meet Christ halfway. You got to decide for Jesus. He comes 99% of the way. You come 1% of the way. They got all this stuff. In fact, there was one debate one time about whether this one guy was a Christian. His name was Bill, and they said, Bill, we're not sure if he's a Christian. And they started ranting and raving about whether Bill's life is showing signs of sanctification or not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, where's Bill? Can we go talk to Bill? Bill was sitting right there. And I looked at Bill, I said, Bill, do you believe in Jesus? Yes. Are you baptized? Yes. You're a Christian. He went, yay! Now, is Bill the kind of Christian he wants to be? Obviously not. But the proof of his Christianity is what Jesus says of Bill, not what Bill is struggling with in response to Jesus. That's Lutherans talking. God doesn't need my good works, Bill. Neighbor does. So yeah, you got some work to do. You need to be a better neighbor to this, that, and the other thing, but you need to be resourced in the certainty that you have in Jesus. And that comes from Jesus, word and sacrament. Straight up, straight out. When he says it, it is. So anyway, I finally looked at these guys and they said, well, what makes Lutherans different? And I said, well, a lot of you guys talk about Christ coming, right? Yeah, Christ come. I said, well, you always kind of say that he stops and kind of waits on us. And I'm telling you, if Christ has to wait on me, I'm messed up, okay? I didn't use that word at the time. I just said, but we preach a Christ who comes all the way to where we are, through words, water, bread, and wine, because words, we don't understand things, so he comes in words. We need to touch, taste, smell, that everything he says is true for me. So he comes every sensory way I need him to come and says, I did it all for you. And I'll never forget, and these are some cool guys. I was privileged to work with them. They said, we've never heard about that Jesus. You preach it every Sunday. So, I guess this first session, I just wanted to lay it out for you. I wanted to get a little deeper on it. This is the kind of stuff you talk with your people and say, before we get into any of this politics stuff, because by the way, politics isn't going to save us, so I don't need community organizers in my church. I don't need people calling the governor right after we have Bible study on this. We've got a process called Champions for Liberty that if you want to get people organized on this stuff, we have a whole year process that teaches them how to be servants, teaches them how to be useful in God's hands, teaches them how to be a servant to the work of the church, not to be out there just going their direction because they're now politically agitated. That's a real danger. And I understand that danger, and if we do ever work with your church, know that we're going to make sure that doesn't happen, okay, and how we train them. But again, as we think about this depth of the gospel, this depth of the freedom that we have, both our created freedom and our eternal freedom that because of Christ's work, that's what the church needs to understand. And nobody can take that away from you. Nobody. They can put a mask on you, and there's some places that are putting masks on us and telling us you'll never worship again, not until we're ready to let you do it. Some churches are saying, no, that time is past. But even if they put a mask on you, they can't stop you from being Christ's people for other people. They can't do that. There's a catacombs version of Christianity for a reason. But again, where are we in that whole panoply of things? We'll talk about it. But again, I want you to understand that. And the last thing I will leave you with is Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus is finally tempted. I think right now there are some of us who think if we just get the politics right, all this will go back to the sanity that we supposedly had beforehand. I think that's the temptation that Jesus has when Satan takes him up on a high mountain and says, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world if you will just bow down and worship me. I think we Lutherans, if we really take our theology seriously, understand we will always be in tension with two kingdoms. We're always going to understand that even if we do stuff well in the left-hand kingdom, it's just temporal. There's something else that's going to break loose. For every solution, we created another problem. How many of you ever changed your constitution in church? It solved some problems. What did it do? It created some other problems, because that's polity, okay? That's polity with sinful human beings. But you better have one so that you don't just let chaos reign. But we don't ever put our ultimate hope and dreams in that kind of discussion. And that's Jesus looking and saying, get thee behind me, Satan, kind of stuff. You will worship the Lord your God. Him only will you serve. And so you bring that love of both freedoms for your people, but you also differentiate those freedoms, and then you want to be faithful to how God works in both those freedoms, ultimately for the sake of the gospel. So the last thing I share with you is our motto, and that is learn how to put your temporal liberties to work for the sake of the eternal liberties of Christ. And that's going to be our next discussion right after lunch, where we'll start to break down and get into this. But remember the Apostle Paul. Remember what he did. He gets beat up in Ephesus. And if you're the guards, they go, oh no, he's a Roman citizen. What do we do now? And you remember what Paul they could have probably just said this, and if you've been to Ephesus, you remember where you can kind of see the whole thing play out. I'm sure they were saying, look, Paul, if we just let you go and you don't bother us with this, hey, anytime you want to come back here, preach the gospel, no problem. We'll usher you right here to the amphitheater and you can have at it. So you could kind of see Paul saying, that would be good. Then I could come preach whenever I wanted to. And then he says, no, I'm going to put my temporal liberties to work. You didn't have the right to beat me to the point of death, and I want to take my case to Caesar himself. And he winds up preaching the gospel to Caesar himself. So I'm just saying the liberty Paul had to do that, you have way more blessings than he had at that moment, because you've been given First Amendment liberties. In fact, in America, Caesar is the citizen. It's been turned totally upside down. So if you give to Caesar what is Caesar's, the question is, you're Caesar. What are you going to do? Because the citizen in America is put in that role. And then the legislature flows from that. So when you contextualize this stuff, what a blessing it is what God has given us. But let's honor the fact that the roots and the enduring power of freedom is something much deeper than just this discussion of how can we be good citizens in America. Well, God bless you. I think we'll see you afterwards. And again, if you have questions, write them down. I'm going to save that last session for questions, and I'll take whatever you want to talk about from the floor. Okay? All right. God bless you. Before we get started, this is not meant to be a defensive discussion. I mean, I know the church needs to defend its public voice for the sake of the culture, and that's part of politics, okay? But this is also a dynamic mindset of how we engage the culture differently. And I just read in preparation, I went upstairs and kind of refreshed myself with some of the notes I've taken over the years on this. When we talk about how we engage at the end of this discussion, there's the Lutheran Church tends to engage indirectly and unintentionally. There's a grid of engagement I'm going to talk about. And I love what he said. The person I was reading, his name is Robert Benny. Anybody know who Robert Benny is? You got to read his book, Paradoxical Vision. It's a really good book. It was kind of fundamental to my PhD stuff, and rightly so. And I think he was just in Lutheran Witness too, right? But Robert Benny talks about the grid of engagement has to do with direct, whether the church engages these things directly or unintentionally or intentionally. And typically, he said, Christians should engage indirectly and unintentionally, or indirectly and intentionally, which means we just operate as Christian citizens and we live in our neighborhoods and we serve and care. And he said, if you operate that way, you don't do good works to transform the culture. You do good works because your neighbor needed them. You leave the transforming of the culture to God, or not to God. And he said that's what makes the Christian engagement different. So even if you're fighting for the institution of family, for instance, which I think we need to fight for to some degree for the sake of the culture, or you're fighting for the sanctity of life, you're not fighting for that because it's you protecting yourself and your people. You're saying this person I'm actually engaging needs that. Well, they happen to disagree with me tremendously. Well, then I got to do all the work it takes to persuade them, or all the work it takes to communicate to them that I'm standing here and saying these things for them. Speak the truth in love. Love has to do with how they're hearing you speak the truth, and you're willing to put up whatever price it takes to actually deliver the goods. I always say pastors are God's UPS men. That's why we wear our uniforms. Our job is to deliver the goods. Well, they wouldn't take it. Well, I'm going to keep coming until you sign on the dotted line and take it. Now, you may dispense it, you may throw it out with the trash, but I'm going to make sure I deliver it to you. And I think you have to have that mindset in my discussion. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the missional ways you can reach out then through Two Kingdoms. That's really that's another discussion. But again, I want to lay out the framework for you and make sure that you have the mindset of saying, we're not just defending the church. We're trying to be God's voice for the sake of the culture in service to the mission of the church. All right, if you want to know more about what I do, lcrlfreedom.org, lcrlfreedom.org. Right now, we have mom and pop papers. We've got 25 of them. I also do a blog on that, so you can listen to it, read it, whatever. Then we have a thing called Word from the Center. Monday and Friday. If you want to sign up, you can go on the webpage, sign up for it. You get a devotion on Monday, and you get a op-ed, an opinion kind of piece from a Two Kingdom perspective on Friday. Now, I had one person say, why are you writing devotions? You weren't sent to D.C. to write devotions. What's your answer to that, Two Kingdom guys? God works two ways, and the ultimate way is through His Word of the Gospel. If I go to D.C. and don't have a devotional Monday, what am I doing there? I'm not a lawyer. You know, I'm just an advocate representing the church. I better have a devotional aspect of my work. I better have a proclamation aspect of my work because it encourages people on the Hill. It encourages people struggling with these issues. So we have a devotion on Monday, and then we have an op-ed on Friday that deals with a lot of these kinds of issues from a Two Kingdom point of view. We also do a Liberty Live alert on every Wednesday at, I think, 2 o'clock Eastern time, 1 o'clock Central, and basically we're dealing with the issues of the day, and we're trying to apply Two Kingdom discussion to that. And so again, it's one of those things where we take on all comers and we deliver it live. I'm hoping to have interviews these next couple of weeks with Molly Hemingway's already said she'd interview with us. I've got Tim Gegline, who's one of our guys in D.C. We're trying to get other people online. The only thing for me is technology. I still don't know exactly how to interview, to have multiple people on my call and broadcast it live. I know how to do the Zoom version of that, but then I got to invite everybody personally. So we're working on making sure that's done well, and I don't have a video guy and a sound guy like I used to have at Lutheran Hour, so we're trying to do the best we can. But all of those things are for you. And then we even have bulletin blurbs if you want to put something in your bulletin every week. So all that stuff is meant to be resource for you. So if you have any questions, like a question came up about what are the rules about maybe going to the hospital or the nursing homes? Is there a general federal rule? The answer is no. The answer is it's mostly state by state. But one of the things I saw in one of the events I went to is people, they had 3 different ribbons or things to put around your wrist. One was red, one was yellow, one was green. So if you were so terrified of COVID, you didn't come, and they broadcast it to you. But if you did come, some of you might be a lot more nervous than others. Then you would wear a red one. And that just meant, hey, if you want to talk or anything, keep your distance because I'm still a little nervous about this. That's fine. Then there was a yellow one, people a little bit more willing to engage, but they're not as frightened about what could happen. And then there were the greens who said, we're okay with this. But they weren't over aggressive either. They kind of played off each other, and it was a great event. And so if that can help you too, just coming up with these kind of ways of dealing with this so we overcome the fear of it. And we start to take control of it because, guys, you and I both know this. We could live in fear of just about anything to the point where we're terrified to come out of our homes. And that's where the Lord tells us we just don't live that way. So let's use wisdom. Let's listen to the CDC and all these different kind of things. But there's a lot of politicians who traffic in fear. And they traffic way beyond what the science says. And as pastors, we need to teach our people to live in the face of fear with a different kind of life, okay? So again, maybe that's a way that you can do it. It was very helpful. And I noticed certain people kept their distance, but they wanted to be there, so they made that choice. Other people stayed home. And then from that point on, we had more fellowship in ways that I think were a real blessing. All right, so all that's there for you. We have our Facebook page. We've got YouTube videos on this stuff. Some people are using these things for, to accent their Bible studies on Romans 13, things like that. They're there for you. Use them any way that you wish. I think the only thing that I say is copyrighted or anything like right now is probably my mom and pops, but even there, just quote it. I mean, it's meant for you, okay? Use it as much as you possibly can. All right, today, now we're going to talk a little bit about this two kingdoms, how we get involved in the world in which we live, because it's a dynamic way of living. You know, I just, again, quote in John 18 where Simon Peter has a sword and Jesus commands him, put your sword away. We all know that Jesus' kingdom does not come through force. If it would come through force, he would have had legions of angels wiping everybody out. And there's a lot of people who think Jesus is coming that way again to set up some kind of millennial kingdom. That's not us. We're living in the millennial kingdom. God is already ruling, and when he comes back, it's going to be new heavens and new earth time. We know that, right? And so again, as God's people, we want to say we're living this side of heaven already in the confidence that the race has been won. And this race is not won through the sword. This race is won through the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, we do really good with that. You know, so when we go out and preach the gospel, we don't need the policeman to do any work for us. We don't need the governor to sanction our work. We don't need any of that stuff. But the question is, what is a Christian policeman supposed to do? You know, like Luther, can you be a Christian to be a soldier? That's where this stuff gets a little bit tougher. Is the policeman who's a Christian to turn the other cheek? Is the policeman to give his shirt off his back? Not according to his vocation. And so again, that's when with the two kingdoms, we have a powerful way of dealing with these questions that I think other faith traditions don't. Put your sword away, because my kingdom comes a different way. But we also struggle with the authorities that be. I just got really loud. Was that good or bad? Okay, sorry about that. All right, so again, even with the religious authorities, there came a point where there was tension within that. There's always going to be tensions with the authorities that be this side of heaven, because theirs is a penultimate role, theirs is a limited role, theirs is a temporal role compared to the eternal work of Jesus. You know, even Luther had to prove to the Roman authorities of his day that he wasn't the new guy. He didn't make up the new stuff, they did. Remember, that was one of his defenses. You guys created the new way of thinking about this, not me. I'm just giving you the old stuff. And so again, as we talk about these kinds of things, we understand there's going to be a tension this side of heaven. So maybe this will help you. We started asking, what kind of question are you talking about here? Now, the evangelicals use this WWJD thing. Do you know what I'm talking about? What would Jesus do? And when I get into a lot of these discussions, they go, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Then do it. Jesus never told you how to engage Caesar. He just said Caesar has his role. See, when you're talking about Caesar's realm or left-hand kingdom work, it's not really a WWJD question. It's a WWFD question. What would the Father have us do? Because the Father's role is to create and sustain the world, as we say in our creeds. Now again, it's not that clear cut, we know that. But in the creed said, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. And I love how the Divine Drama says it. What is it? I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker and owner of heaven and earth. This is all his stuff. We're just merely stewards of his things. And so it's what would the Father do to not only order this world, but to preserve this world. And so there's lots of Bible verses like, if you won't work, you shouldn't eat. That's a WWFD kind of perspective. Honor your father and your mother. Thou shalt not steal, which means you have to have private property that you can put to work for the sake of the gospel, and the other people don't have access to that just because they want it. WWFD. Now, he's not going to save the world through his preserving work, But he's going to do just that. He's going to preserve the world through the curbing work of the law. And so again, as we get involved in these kind of things, those are the kind of things we're debating when we're talking about public policy. Because public policy is the rules of government, the rules of the community for the sake of the civilizing of the community. Lutherans talk about this two kingdom stuff like putting in a basement floor of civility for the culture. And so again, I don't know, when you build a house, do you guys have basements here? Okay, there's other places around the country don't have basements, but they have foundations. You can't build a house without a foundation, and you can't build a house without a good basement. But nobody lives on the foundation. Nobody lives in the basement. You live upstairs. You build the house on that foundation. Well, left-hand kingdom work is foundation work. And so you might want to build your foundation a little deeper than I do. You might want to build a little bit higher than I do, but you know that we got to put a foundation in. Now, there are people today who don't believe in any foundations. Do you understand that? That's the debate. That there is no foundation. There is no truth. There is no moral structure. It's just, I'm the solution. I'm the final arbiter of my life. That's not a foundation a society can be built on, and that needs to be engaged even for the sake of the society in which we live. So WWFD, or maybe the question is, what would Jesus really do? WWJRD. And what would Jesus really do? He would honor the work of the Father. He would fulfill the work of the Father. What does Jesus say? There's not going to be any aspect of the law that goes unfulfilled in my work. And so to that degree, Jesus would honor the things that need to be honored, even as he saves the world by grace through faith, and offers it by grace through faith through the cross. So again, when we get involved in these kind of questions, we try to do what the Father would want done in the community for the sake of the community, even as we find a way to share the good news of Jesus in that community as well. And that's what I think I love about what Benny says about if you do these good works or engage these cultural things, you know that they're not going to save, you know that they're just there to preserve, and you're not so much worried about transforming the culture, you're worried about, did I take care of my neighbor? So, as I told you about my urban stuff, whenever I got involved in urban stuff and people say, your church doesn't belong here, I said, well, we'll see, you know. And the question was, am I serving the neighbors that God has sent me? Finding out what their needs are, what their cares are, some of the things I know they need, because God says we all need them as human beings. And how could our church undergird those? How could we help build their families, keep their families together? How could we help stabilize the neighborhood so that they could send their kids to school? How could we be a part of that? And we weren't so much concerned about transforming the neighborhood as much as were we blessing the people that we were called to serve. And then what did we hope? We hoped that they would ask us someday, why did you do that? And what would our answer be? Because our Lord sent us to bless you and to take care of the places that he had sent us. And so again, that's our vision of this stuff, even as we talk about two kingdoms going forward. So again, I like that, WWJRD. What would Jesus really do? He would never despise the things of the Heavenly Father because somehow it gets in the way of his saving the world by grace through faith. He fulfills and then offers his work as a gift. So again, we should have that mentality as we get involved in these left-hand kingdom issues. All right, so how does God engage the world? Like we've been talking about, he engages the world two distinct ways. I think that's what I've really grown to appreciate about Lutheran theology. Law, gospel, they are both God's words, but they function differently. You as Lutherans know how the law works. How many of you ever, when you preach on Jesus' teaching on divorce and remarriage, what's the next week like at church? You know, if you just read those verses, I mean, suddenly you got all kinds of guilty consciences. You got people calling I preached that. I remember when I was a third year out of seminary and I preached it and I made sure I got the text right and I made sure that I applied the gospel. And as far as I was concerned, I said, basically, there's forgiveness for those of you who've sinned in this regard. That's what I thought I said. I had more phone calls and more counseling sessions that week afterwards because the law just did its work, even because it was read. it just uncovered things, and I had to counsel, and then I had to say, I didn't say that. What you said, I said, no, I said something exactly the opposite. Jesus still can love you. Jesus does love you. So again, you know how the law works. You know how the gospel works, and you know how they work radically two different ways. Well, it's the same thing in understanding God's two kingdom work in the world. We've got to differentiate those works, and we can't expect too much of God's preserving work because it's just going to keep things intact. That's one of the reasons why I really think the biggest struggle we have today, the biggest struggle I think is with what I call the secular pietists. And people have said that Luther's theology isn't relevant today. You know, Luther's theology, that you're saved by grace through faith, and remember Tetzel, and if you just went in and you dropped that money in Tetzel's cup, then, souls were free from purgatory or your sins could be covered. And everyone said, Luther's response was, no, Jesus saves you, and by the perfect work that he did on the cross to the resurrection, you don't need that kind of thing. And everyone says, well, that's so yesterday's news. I don't think so. We got this thing called secular pietism. If you don't drive the right car, you're not going to be saved. If you don't give the right taxes or vote for the right policy, you're not going to be blessed. And we're going to make sure you feel the weight of that. You come in the middle of that and preach a whole different way of life, a gospel mercied way of life. Your theology is just as relevant today. And so that 100% sinner, 100% saint, law gospel is such a powerful thing. All right, so God engages the world, again, just to set the biblical stage. He is the creator, the orderer, and the owner. If I was to write a missional aspect of left-hand kingdom stuff, it would be on that first thing, that we as God's people need to also proclaim to the world that God is the creator, the orderer, and the owner of the world. And so when we proclaim Father, Mother, Child, the Trinity of civility, if you will, and also God's ordered way of building a society through families, that's not our view of life, that's God's view of things. And so if something attacks that, which I think the 60s did, the 60s attacked all these traditional orderings of the world as if I'm the only one that mattered. And so sexual libertinism or social libertinism, that I'm the final authority on all of these things, is attacking that notion. Creator, orderer, and owner. So when you proclaim these things, even as blessings, you could be attacked for that. I think this is where we're struggling. Because the minute I say something like family, or the minute I say something like thou shalt not commit adultery, or thou shalt not bear false witness, or thou shalt not, and all the thou shalt nots, the finger points back at, I'm just as broken as everybody else. Isn't it hard to proclaim the truth of something when you're as guilty as they are? I think that's where we're struggling. But parents, what do you do with your kids? What if they find out that you had this problem when you were their age? What do you do? Do you say, well, it doesn't matter to you because I did it when I was... No, in fact, sometimes you say, because I did it, I know that you're not supposed to do it. So again, there comes a point where if we really care about people, we're going to have to risk being fools for Christ, fools for the Scripture, fools for the Father, because he says, this is who I am, creator, orderer, and owner. And so we as Christians then come with this humility that says this is his thing, not our thing, and it actually calls us to account just like you. In fact, one of my favorite things in evangelism was always, when people said, who do you think you are? And I would say, well, I'm just like you. Now can we talk? You know what I mean? Even as a pastor, I'm just like you, and I need 100% his grace. Now can we talk? What a beautiful thing to say. But again, so when we get involved in some of these left-hand kingdom things, the founding fathers said it this way. They said there can be no just law if it doesn't reflect the biblical law in some way, shape, or form. You struggle with how to apply some of the Ten Commandments into actual policies in life, especially with those who don't believe. But the founding fathers said there can be no just law that violates biblical law. Well, we have all kinds of stuff right now that's violating biblical law. When you look at what happened in New York. Oh, by the way, again, we'll talk a little bit about this, but not much. But, with the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court is not about putting a conservative judge on versus a liberal judge. That's not what it is. It's putting a constitutional judge on board versus a person who thinks the judges should be able to legislate from the bench. If you read up on this, and if you want to know more about this, Woodrow Wilson was the first guy who actually thought this way. He wanted the Supreme Court. He was tired of the restrictions of the Constitution. He thought we were modern people. By the way, he was the most racist president we've ever had. So if this stuff always seems to coalesce with racist folks. But he wanted to pack the court, and he wanted to expand the court because he wanted the court to start legislating, because he didn't think the legislatures would ever be fast enough for the kind of changes that modern society needed. So he thought that the Constitution was too restrictive, and he wanted to change the court's dynamics. Well, the Founding Fathers said if the court ever becomes a legislative body, that would be the definition of tyranny in America, and you as an individual citizen would cease to exist. And that's what they fought against, okay? So again, that's the debate. So it's not left versus right. It's constitutional restrictions versus a person who thinks they can legislate without legislative accountability. Because if your legislator doesn't vote the way you want, what can you do with your legislator? You can't do that with a judge, which is why the judge was supposed to be bound to the Constitution. So judges are going to, even if you vote a conservative, supposedly originalist in, they still may not come up with the ruling you wanted, but at least they're trying to understand it from an originalist perspective. And that's the debate on the courts. But it's about your freedom that's at stake. So creator, order, owner, but again, we rebel against that authority, we rebel against that, so God has to act to preserve and save. The reason why I'm circling back on this, our people don't think God is at work right now. They're sitting here watching all this craziness happen, and they think we're left to the devices of what's happening in our culture. You need to tell them, no, God is at work. You just need to tell them that. God is at work to preserve and to save, even right now. I think that was as shocking when Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. I think that was as shocking then as it would be today. Think of the president you didn't want. And say, give to that guy what honor he deserves. It would be just as shocking to say that today. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, because God is at work through Caesar. How about Cyrus the Persian in the Old Testament? How in the world is he God's anointed? But he's doing something that God wants for the sake of his work. So trust that this God who is in heaven has all things working together for good. I don't know if we're in the Satan's little season time. I don't think so. Maybe we are. But at that time, it's going to be confusing because it's going to look like all hell is breaking loose on earth. And even then, he's using it to just merely line up the data for Satan's ultimate demise. Okay? So as we go about our business, let's make sure our people know God is always at work. And we can be part of his undergirding work, his preserving work, as well as his saving work. So again, just a couple of verses. Obviously, I've been talking about Matthew 22, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. And John 18, where Jesus says, put the sword away. My kingdom does not come through force. And again, we don't want, so I'm going to ask the question in our Liberty Alert this weekend, can a Christian be a better citizen in America than everybody else? By the way, here's a question that was asked 2 or 3 times in the last couple years. If you believe that Jesus Christ is the only Savior of the world, how can you then be a public servant for everybody? That was asked by a senator to a person who's going to be in the cabinet of our president. And that guy started hemming and hawing and apologizing and I love everybody and blah, 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 blah. What's the right answer? The answer is, Senator, I can be more attentive to the needs of people I disagree with than even you can. Why? Because we don't legislate the main teaching of the church. We don't want the government to do any part of that. We don't want the government to have anything to do with talking about who Jesus is or what Jesus did or what that message is. So as far as we differentiate the ultimate message of the church from the basic stuff of the left-hand kingdom, which everybody has a role in because it's about legislating morality and legislating traditions that keep us sane. So I, sir, actually can have commonality with people who I disagree with about ultimate things, but I can agree with them about some of these basic things that keep things sane. You can't, because he can't differentiate those two. He can only take care of the partisan things he agrees with. You and I can actually set some of those things aside for the sake of civility. And I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But what an answer that would be. Senator, I ask you to try to live up to the way I would do it. I don't think you can. And then see if he can then be a public servant for the sake of all. So again, I think our way of engaging this, John 18, Romans 13, submit to the authorities. When you start unpacking that word authority, he's not talking about submitting just to the good authorities. There is a sense where God is in control of all the authorities that are going on in this world, and that's what's kind of shocking. It's shocking for us to say, how can I submit to that, Lord? He's not saying agree with it. He's not saying carry through with it. He's just saying honor the level of that authority that needs to be honored for the sake of my ordering of things, but you're my voice of the gospel, which he has no control over. And so again, I always talk about this as if you do finally disobey or disagree, you're willing to take whatever comes your way, even from an unjust authority. We saw that with Germany, Nazi Germany, things like that. But it's like that all over the world even now. Christians are being persecuted today more than they've ever been persecuted in history, just for being Christian. And by the way, the Southern Poverty Law Center hasn't declared it yet, but I think very soon Jesus, proclaiming the things of Christ, he'll be on the hate speech list too. Because Jesus says something like, that's crazy, like I'm the only way, the only truth, the only, you can't say that. And so that's discriminatory, and that's microaggressions, and that's all that kind of stuff. So I think Martin Luther King is on it in some places now too, because he wasn't as aggressive enough in his nonviolent approach to left-hand kingdom stuff, and I think Jesus will eventually be on their list too. What's the answer? Don't worry about it. God's at work to preserve and save. Be even more bold for the sake of your neighbor. And then 2 Corinthians, be finally ambassadors of Christ, and that's where it comes down to what would Jesus really do? Learn how to honor the things of the Father even as you share the good news of the gospel. Okay? So again, trying to lay this way of thinking out. Christians engage, we get to be useful in his hands with a different mindset. And so one of the questions was, how are we going to get involved in people's lives with this? Well, that's the point. I love Romans 12. In view of God's mercy, what? Present your bodies. Jump in. Once you have this knowledge, jump into the lives of other people and see what God can do. I've always said in evangelism, my wife is probably the best evangelist in our house. I've never seen anybody who's been able to walk into diverse sets of people and come out with really good friends who suddenly want to know Jesus just because they got to know her. It's amazing to me. We have a group coming over this week called the Violators. The Violators are from Santa Ana. They're from every culture in the world. And the reason why we became really good friends with them is my wife finally got a ticket and had to go to one of those things in the Santa Ana Police Department or the DMV, to knock the ticket down. She came home with 6 new friends. They call themselves the Violators. We have a Violators Christmas party every year. One's from Pakistan, one is from Iran, well, 2 are from Iran, one is an Anglo guy, one's from Guadalajara. Suddenly, we're talking about Jesus and singing Christmas songs together. So again, when you talk about it, in view of his mercy, jump in and with this 2-kingdom mindset that understands how to differentiate these things, understands common human concerns that can ultimately get to preaching the good news of the gospel, understands temporal freedom so you can introduce eternal freedom. You understand these dynamics, but you jump into the game. And usually the jump in is God sends the people to you. You just kind of walk right into it. You get called to a congregation. You get called to a neighborhood. There you are. You don't have to let it come to you. That was the hardest part about being Lutheran hour speakers. I didn't have that, who are my people? Where are they coming from? That was disconcerting for me as a pastor. With a broader purpose, Jeremiah 29, that's every urban guy reads that verse, seek the peace of the city. So left-hand kingdom stuff always in service to the good news of the gospel. Then Christians engage with a unique mindset. We have a Christ-like mind, and now that you know that it's not just WWJD, do whatever, it's WWJRD, do what Jesus would really do, honor the Father if it's left-hand kingdom stuff, even as you preach the good news of the gospel through Christ. This Christ-like mind is this mind that says, I'm here for you with this message. I can differentiate things. I've jumped in, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to keep coming and keep coming and keep coming for you, because that's the mind of Christ. He was willing to empty himself. He was willing to actually be nothing so that you could be everything. And it does not matter what your circumstances are then. It just matters, are you looking at the circumstances as the opportunities to be this two-kingdom citizen for somebody else? Now, I met a two-kingdom guy that blew my mind. His name was John, and it was down in the prison of Angola. You know what? Have you ever heard the story of Angola prison? If you go to the Bible Museum in D.C., which I would recommend all of you go to, on I think the 4th floor, there is a cell from Angola, a white cell from Angola in the Bible Museum. It's because the warden, when he got there, he said they took all of his money away to educate the criminals. And by the way, this is the bloodiest prison in America. If you got sent to Angola, you were sent to die there. You usually didn't last that long because there was killings and all kinds of stuff happened in a regular fashion. You were scared to, even the hardened criminals were afraid to be sent to Angola. So the warden comes and he's told no more education money, no more nothing, just these guys go there to die. He says, good. Good. He goes, yeah, I don't need educated criminals. I need changed criminals. So he talked to this seminary, and instead of sending pastors into the prison, he said, I'm going to put a seminary in the prison. And I'm going to give criminals an opportunity to earn the right to go to seminary. And then those who come to know Jesus, I'm going to set them loose on the prison itself. They've asked Concordia, Seminary St. Louis, and Fort Wayne if they'd be willing to participate in some of these prisons around the country too. There's now one going on in Texas, in the Texas system too, where they're putting seminaries in the prison. Well, I got to visit Angola. So I go to Angola. Now, have you ever been to maximum security prisons? These are all lifers. They scared me half to death. You know, I'm like, I walk in, it was like Mayberry RFD. There are people walking around everywhere. Now, this is a place where just probably 30 years ago, if there was a shiv on the ground, 2 or 3 people get knifed by that shiv. Now there's weapons everywhere, and people are walking freely. And I finally said, well, these can't be all the lifers. They said, no, every one of them's a lifer. Every one of them's here for good. How did this happen? The story of John. John was one of the first prisoners. He was there for murder. He was 17 years old. He said, I deserve to be there. He said, that's my lot. But I started years later. There's all these businesses within the prisons. There's freedom within these prisons, even though these guys are all still lifers. And John told this story, and listen to this story. He said, first of all, I learned I was not an animal. I learned I was a man. Then I learned that God actually died for me so that I could be his man forever. And I realized that I was actually a person of worth because of a Savior named Jesus. I wanted to know everything I could know about that Jesus. So he studied for 4 years in that seminary, and he became what we would call ordained. Okay? But really, he was just now certified to be sent out into the prison. His first call was to death row. How would you like that, guys? It's not a dual parish. It's a tough. He walks in, the guard said, strip. Now, why did he say strip? Because these are the hardened guys, the worst of this prison. Blood Alley was how you get to their place because people were always dying on the way to that place. And he says strip because we don't want any shivs, we don't want anything being passed. We don't want any riots happening after your visit, Pastor. Stripped him naked. Now, how do you think the guys inside were going to treat him? They start laughing at him, howling, carrying on. Oh, come preach, pray with me, preach, pray with me. And John said at that moment he was so humiliated. And Philippians 2 came to his mind. He said, if he could empty himself and become nothing, I can stand here naked and keep coming to these guys. And he did it day after day after day after day, ridicule after ridicule after ridicule. Finally, and he's just telling his story like it's no big deal. Finally, about 3.5 months into that process, the guard says, keep your clothes on, preach. And then the baddest guy in the prison, when he walks in, he says, can I pray for you? Can I tell you about my Savior? He says, get over here. And he says, why? He goes, any God who sends a guy like you to me is a God I want to get to know. And they said that's when that prison started to turn. And now it's one of the safest prisons in America. And John told the story. He said, now I loved Angola. Can you imagine? I loved Angola. What a weird thing to say. And the warden said, well, we're going to send you out 2 by 2 to every prison in Louisiana. And John said, that was the time I was most afraid because I loved being in Angola so much. So, you have a great church and you get sent someplace else. You have the same tribulation. I love this place. And John said, but we went anyway. Philippians 2. Have this mind. And so I always ask my parishioners, hey, do you know anybody who's a Philippians 2 person? And they all think, well, we don't know anybody like John. I said, well, that's you. You're a Philippians 2 person. So 2 kingdom principles we'll talk about in just a minute with that Philippians 2 mindset. Okay? So all I'm saying is if you want to have how do we think about these things? We strive for excellence in all we do, not just for excellence sake, but to serve our neighbor and to tell them about this God who we're serving in his name. So strive for excellence in all we say or do, giving God glory, serving others in his name. Again, I looked at, what makes Christians different, what makes a church different than a help agency. What made my going to Concordia, Ann Arbor, which is a little tiny school, better than going to University of Michigan, which is where I thought I was going to get matriculate, and that was my dream. Well, I realized that even Michigan could strive for excellence, but not to give God glory, and not to serve others in his name. They can only strive for excellence sake. And we see what sinful humans can do with even that. So that's what you're telling your people. This is who we are, and we're 2 kingdom citizens for the sake of the neighbors God brings into our life. All right. So here's some how-tos. Looking at my time here. Community engagement with this mindset. Dynamic differentiation. We've already talked about this, right? Lutherans tend to be accused of being quietists. We're not quietists. We dynamically engage, but we differentiate the questions. There's a lot of stuff going on today that's mixing the gospel with public policy again. And I'm not talking about the right wing. I'm talking about kind of this view of utopia, that Jesus came to liberate us, all this kind of stuff. That never liberates us temporally, and it sure doesn't liberate us eternally. So again, if you're looking for liberation and transformation, you're going to find out that God's left-hand kingdom work is going to disappoint you. But usually that disappointment leads to people doing really crazy things that make things even worse. In urban stuff that we were doing, we were always trying to find a way to undergird, stabilize, and get people to start to see that they could take control of their lives. But that still wasn't the ultimate message of the good news of the gospel. We differentiated those 2 works for the sake of our community. So involved, but with tempered expectations of what we can do, and unlimited expectations of what God can do. As I said, a lot of our children are being taught that that it's unlimited what they can do. I think that's a terrible temptation that leads them to the point where they think they're the God of their own life. There's a sense where they need to understand who God is, who they are in God's ordering of things, who they are because they're God's unique creation, and what God can do in their lives for the sake of others. That's a beautiful thing. But this idea that it's unlimited what I can do with my expertise, my technology, my wealth, that's the greatest temptation of all. That's back to Matthew 4. I'll give you everything if you just bow down and worship me. Now, this is the one I really like. Reformation restraint, seeking justice. Do you understand what I'm saying there? So we now know how God works. Okay, my case study was Ferguson in my paper. And so the question always is, what should you do? And I remember as the Lutheran hour speaker, they said, Pastor, you got to say something. I said, well, I don't know what to say yet. I don't know who's the bad guy. I don't know if it's the policeman or if it's the guy that got shot. I'm not sure. But the only thing I could say at that point is protect the businesses, because I knew they didn't deserve it. But that's really not much of a statement. And by the way, I was saying it from the outside because I wasn't a person in Ferguson. But I found there's a guy in Ferguson, a pastor. He wasn't a Lutheran, but he was a pastor who practiced what I call Reformation restraint. So here's my point. There are a lot of people, even pastors, who were marching on the police stations. And do you remember this? Well, they wanted to burn down Ferguson's police station. By the way, the reason why I think all that craziness happened in Ferguson, in my opinion, is because Ferguson was like Mayberry RFD. And whoever had it in for this kind of stuff said, let's go after them, because if we go after the NYPD, they won't let us do this to them. But again, so they went after Ferguson, and I think it was just like, what do we do? And they hunkered down. Well, this pastor was watching the neighborhood descend on the police station, and he came out, and he said, hold it. I know a lot of you people in this crowd, and I don't know all of you people where some of you came from, but I know a lot of you folks, this isn't right. This is our neighborhood. And I know a lot of people in there, and there's some good people in there. Now, if you let me, I'm going to go inside, and I'm going to bring somebody out, and we can talk this through until we know exactly what happened. That's Reformation restraint. Even if that police station was corrupt, we're going to find out the right way so it doesn't destroy our community. Because we don't just rebel in our first way of doing things. We have a restraint. God is at work here. I don't even understand how he's at work here, but I'm not going to find out after we burn it all down. But once we engage it, we're seeking justice here. And we're going to get to the truth here. And I'm going to be part of that. But here's how we're going to go about it. And he walked into the police station, got someone, they came out, and they were able to resolve that situation, which allowed it to take its more proper course and allowed the truth to finally come out about what really had happened. Man, I was proud of that guy, man. Because that took tremendous courage. But he had to have the courage to see that God could be at work in a place that no one else saw it at that point. And yet he was willing to understand that and try to honor that as much as he could. Now, if there was, he had no problem saying, we're going to bring these guys to justice otherwise. He had no problem saying that, but he said, we're going to do it this way. And I think, again, that shows Reformation restraint seeking justice. You can see Luther that way with the Peasants' Revolt, if you read the Peasants' Revolt. Now, sad thing about it, I heard, is that only part of Luther's teachings got mass-produced. And so people didn't always hear both sides of what Luther said about the Peasants' Revolt right at the time. Editing seems to always happen in our world, right? And the wrong one gets out at the wrong time, or the right one gets out at the wrong time. But Reformation restraint. Vocational respect, seeking the truth. I also love this one. All the commandments 4 to 10 have two functions. One, by virtue of our common conscience and ancestry, we all are part of this curbing work of trying to honor the law of God. We're going to find out that we break it. We're going to find out that we don't live up to it, and we're going to need an answer from God that we can't fashion on our own. But that's why the gospel's here. But there's also this civilizing work of that 10 commandments. Dignity of family, sanctity of life, purpose of property, honoring one's name, the proper understanding of all gifts, vocational respect. Now, here's how you practice that. When I was a pastor in the Hell's Kitchen area, I also had work up on the Upper West Side in Morningside Heights. That's right near Columbia University. Anybody watch Seinfeld? That's where the Seinfeld restaurant is. Okay, it's right up in there, and it's a lot of hoity-toity things, you know, and if you ever sit in one of the restaurants there, you usually run into these parents who are in their late 40s who have their child for the first time because they're Columbia PhDs. They didn't have time for kids when they're 20, they didn't have time for kids when they're 30, so they get married at 40 and they have a child at 45. It's the most hilarious thing to watch Columbia parents with a 2-year-old. Because here's what's usually happening. They're looking, and Johnny is eating the food, and he's usually got mashed potatoes or something, and then he realizes how fun it is to shoot the mashed potatoes at mom and dad. It's a lot of fun. You should try this, Johnny's saying. And he shoots it at mom, and it hits her right in the face. And have you ever heard a Columbia parent at that moment? Johnny, now we've talked about this. You're invading mommy's space, and this is not the way you should be as a young man. And Johnny's like, they're not going to stop me, you know. Bam, you know. He's just having a great time, and they don't know what to do because they will not raise their hand to poor little Johnny. I think a lot of them are Antifa kids now, but I'm just teasing. But anyway, but my thing is when you're watching this, what don't you do? What don't you do? You see this happening. And you realize this is crazy. They're letting a 2-year-old take over the table. You have vocational respect. They're still the parents. You still allow them to be the parents. Even if you want to go over them and tell them this is the worst thing you can do with the child at this age, to let them define the boundaries of your house. But you have vocational respect. About the only time you might go over there is if little Johnny shoots a long one. You know, now you may have to say something. But do you understand what I'm saying? And so when we get involved in people's lives, we don't come with this know-it-all attitude. We come in with this understanding that God can actually work sometimes through their stupidity, just like He's worked through our stupidity to show us a better way to discipline, or that all kids are not the same, or how to honor our neighbor when they're not exactly like we are. All those kind of things is because you're coming in with that mindset of a two-kingdom understanding of God is at work. He works through vocations, and I'm going to find a way to engage at that vocational level so maybe I can share the good news of the gospel. So again, that's two-kingdom thinking. And that's putting the left-hand kingdom to work for the sake of the gospel. I really get this a lot. If you're a Christian, how can you be a one-issue voter? By the way, I'm not a one-issue voter. If you want to know all the issues I'm voting for and why, I'd be happy to tell you. But if it came down to one issue, sanctity of life would be it. I just don't know what the point of voting at all is if I start to treat you as less than human. I just don't see it. And if we start voting and saying, well, these lives are not worth living and those lives are not worth living, but the rest of it here we can vote this way, I just don't see the point. Because eventually they're coming for you too. So sanctity of life is one that I think we can defend in a healthy way for the sake of all people. And the greatest way to do it is to get engaged with somebody who disagrees vehemently with you and say, I still value your life too, with the same dignity that I value mine and those that I love. That just blows people's minds that you can do that. Again, the Darwinian way of thinking? Absolutely not. You only value that which is utilitarian, that which is useful to society. The secular way of doing it, there's certain people that don't have value because of what they can or cannot do. You come and say, no, even those that we don't think have intrinsic value because we can't see it, they have value because God is their God and their Savior. Powerful stuff. All right. Now, with the two-kingdom then perspective, we have the preeminence of grace over law. You know, we're going to lose some of these battles in the left-hand kingdom. Guys, just get used to it. There's going to be that. Satan's better organized, I think. And also, serving things, it's much easier to coerce things into being than it is to serve things into being. But Jesus says, don't be shocked by the fact that my weakness is way stronger than their strength, even if you can't see it. So there's a preeminence of grace over law because this left-hand kingdom work is penultimate. Boldly proclaim the gospel and apply the law in reference to this public morality. So again, I'm just saying you're going to have to learn how to also proclaim God's ordering of the world. That's part of our work. We have to be a moral voice to the culture in which we live. It starts with our own congregation. So if you're preaching law and gospel to your congregation, just preach and teach the text and serve your people and let that flow out. But again, we're getting skittish on some of these things because somehow we feel like maybe modern people don't live this way anymore. One of the issues that's going to come up is the sexual orientation stuff. And I always say, well, have we stopped preaching that living together is wrong? Anybody preaching that's no big deal? I love this one guy, his name is Jordan Peterson. Do you know who I'm talking about? He said, yeah, here's what living together is. You know, everyone says, oh, we love each other, let's live together. Really means we love each other, let's live together. I don't feel like committing to you. In fact, I want to have all the blessings of marriage, but I want to make sure that I keep my options open in case I run into someone else who's maybe a little bit better, more enticing to me, and then I can just leave you because I really haven't committed anything to you. And the only reason why we do it that way is the other person is treating me as badly as I'm treating them. That's living together. Now saying I love you and I will be your husband or be your wife to the day you die, and I will learn to love you each and every day because my God learns to love me each and every day and applies His mercy every day, means my love is going to grow for you even beyond my capacity to love you because there's going to be Christ's love in me now sharing with you. I want to see what that's like. Now we preach that, don't we? And so if someone says, well, living together, bless them in Christ, that's the same thing. No, they're not. Now, all I'm saying is it's just as tough to preach that today as some of this other stuff, right? Find a way to preach it. Because your people need what only Christ can provide. They need the blessing that Christ can give. And He does it through law and gospel. He does it through His word, back and forth, and He draws people unto Himself. Be willing to be that fool for Christ who gets involved in people's lives. So, boldly proclaim the gospel, humbly the law, We have a grid of engagement. And here's the last thing I'm going to teach you right now, and I hope this is helpful. Prefer A and B to C and D. You have no idea what that means. Great. Because here it comes. Prefer A and B to C and D. This is that grid of engagement that I told you about that actually was Robert Benny's book, Paradoxical Vision. And this, I think, will help you because there's a lot of people who just want, Pastor, tell us what the right thing is, and then we're going to charge Washington. That's not how, we're not there to charge Washington. We're there to preach the gospel if it happens to be in Washington or in the middle of Des Moines. Okay? So here's how Christians generally engage the culture in which we live. Indirect and unintentionally. What that means is you're talking about the scripture. You're going through Matthew chapter 5, or you're going through Jesus, or the Ten Commandments in Exodus. You're going through all these different things. You're talking about the moral perspective of God. You're talking about God the Creator. We're the created. You're talking about the fact that our identity is really not in our tribalism. It's our identity is in who our God is and what our God does. You're talking about all that kind of stuff, and it seeps into your people's lives, and they begin to emanate that out in the places where they live and work. My dad said he found out a lot of times, my father worked for Ford Motor Company, and he had these teams that used to launch new plants all over the world. And he said, I had these guys that I could always count on them. And a lot of them, after a while, I found out they're Lutheran. He said he found this one guy. He said, well, do you go to church? He goes, yeah, what church? Lutheran. He didn't know that. He didn't hire him because he was Lutheran. He said there was just something that emanated about some of these guys. You could count on them. They would work all the way to the end. If they didn't do the job right, they took responsibility. And he said they just so happened to be. I just found out this other guy's name is Kevin Sorbo. Do you know what I'm talking about? Guy that was Hercules. He was Lutheran. He grew up in Lutheran church. You know, I'm just saying there's something about I'm attracted with the way that guy talks about a lot of issues. I go, man, that guy is very wise on a lot of these things. There's a point. Some of this stuff just emanates out of the people that really get it, right? Law, gospel, that we're forgiven sinners, all these different kinds of things. So indirect, unintentional, that's what I mean. You would never know, but it just is who they are, and it's what comes out of us because the Word of God does its work in and through our lives. Indirect and intentional. Indirect means that the church doesn't speak as a whole here, but now we're talking about intentional things. So there might be some issues where I say religious liberty is an issue, or sanctity of life is an issue, or this particular moral thing is an issue in our community. We talk about it. So we talk about it in Bible class, or we talk about it together. And then you do something intentional, but I don't tell you what to do. He says this is the best way for the church to be influential in society. I agree with him. And he says this is the way Lutherans generally influence society because of two kingdoms. We honor God's vocational work in the left-hand kingdom, and we don't think we can change everything just because we're smarter than everybody else. So indirect, unintentional, indirect, intentional. Here comes the places where it rises, though. The church as an institutional voice says, thus saith the Lord. Direct and unintentional, which means that we speak about it, but we're still not, organizing lobbyists or direct mail-in campaigns and all that kind of stuff. But direct and intentional, that's where we finally say, no, we just got to take our stand here and no place else. Can you see that there are not too many places like that for the church? Why? Because that becomes the ultimate work of the church in society. And it's not. It's just laying a basement floor in. And basement floors never even come close to the good news of preaching the gospel. Now, when it's fundamental things that are being attacked, we have to defend those fundamental things. So the four things that we defend for you in D.C., here they come, ready? Religious liberty, because that's something I defend for all people. Sanctity of life, I defend that for all people. That's a biblical mandate. We can't not do that. And then the institution of marriage, but we defend that as a religious liberty issue, right? The biggest problem we've got is that Washington now has decided what a good relationship is. Have you ever met any of these people from Washington? The last thing that you want them telling you is what a good relationship is. And they did, by fiat. I'll give you the argument of that kind of thing about gay marriage. We say, what's the state's role in marriage? The state's role in marriage is to actually take rights away from people so that we can live more civilly, because states don't grant rights. You already have inalienable rights. Their job is to undergird them. So what is the reason that a state would take the rights away from a man and a woman and make them sign a contract called marriage? What's the reason why the state wants to do that? Because they have to be able to define their reason for taking away my rights for the sake of the good of all. What's the answer? Anybody know? Children, that's it. They don't want to raise your kids because a good society has moms and dads who raise their kids, and the last thing we want to do is raise your own children, because that's the job of a healthy society, not an intrusive state. There is no argument for gay marriage from that point of view. None. And our argument as Lutherans has been, if you can't keep your nefarious hands out of male and female relationships by making them sign a marriage, get out of the whole marriage business. And let us define it in our communities. And let us show you how a healthier society can be built by healthy marriages without your coercive nonsense in the middle of it. So again, I've even argued that with some of the gay activists, and they go, well, I kind of agree with that. Yeah. Isn't that nice? So again, even there, we can find common cause with people who disagree with us about the whole concept of marriage, but understand how the role of government should be. And then we have to persuade our communities that the institution of marriage is God's ideal for them. I'm okay with it. And then the last one is educational freedom. If I was to be a lobbyist in D.C., it would be for the sake of our schools. If we can't get our schools back into the cities, if we can't get our schools back into the neighborhoods, then we have no way of raising up the kind of virtuous citizens that can make all of this stuff work anyway. So again, one of these days maybe it'll flip. But right now I'm not a lobbyist, I'm an advocate for you. But again, I think those four can rise to the direct and intentional. The last two are not policies, they're just religious liberty issues. Let us have the freedom to do the things. And so we argue for educational choice for parents, parental choice. That I believe in equal access for education. Education helps people get out of poverty. And so give the parents the resources they need, and make sure that everyone has those resources. But they're the parents, not you. They can take that money wherever they want. And if we ever get to that point, that's one of the reasons why they hate Trump. I'm telling you this right now, because he's an educational choice guy. Not an educational choice, a parental choice. That's a big difference, because then the parents have the authority. And boy, the bureaucrats hate that. But that flows from our way of thinking of parental authority, it flows from our way of thinking of education, and it flows from our way of being servants. We would love to be able to afford putting schools back in the middle of some of these neighborhoods that don't have any choice anymore. So those are the four, and we try to limit it to that because we don't want anyone to ever think that our role as a church is to be government focused. Our role as a church is to be community focused for the places where God sends us and use these left-hand kingdom things in service to the gospel. All right, so I hope that helps. We've got mom and pop papers on this that try to explain it a little bit more, try to make it more anecdotal, connected to some issues. Like I said, when we talk about vocational respect, we try to give you examples about this. So if you want, you can go to our website and read all 24 of those. But I've given you a couple of copies of some of the ones that we have, just so you can get kind of a flavor. And if those are more helpful for you to share with your parishioners, that's great by me too. But again, two kingdoms, engage the culture for the sake of the culture and for the sake of the gospel. I don't see how you can do it any other way, because you got to engage the culture on God's terms and on their terms, so that you can talk about the God who orders and the God who saves. And I think the Lord gives us the wisdom to ask the right questions. I hope that somehow has been very helpful to you. Thank you so much, and we'll talk about the American experiment, how we have some unique opportunities and challenges because we happen to live in this culture, and we'll talk about that next. See ya.